I was walking along a narrow path in the middle of a blooming garden when I spotted him. Leo stood nearby, facing the setting sun. His blonde hair shimmered in the warm rays, and his dark eyes seemed even more mysterious. He turned and our eyes met. It was so unexpected that I held my breath for a few seconds. He came closer, and I could smell the faint scent of lavender lingering on his clothes. We began to speak, cautiously at first, as if we were afraid to bring up the past. I talked about my travels, and he talked about new hobbies. Time seemed to stand still as Leo leaned closer to hear me better. We decided to walk along the paths of the park. After the rain, the ground was damp and the air was fresh, saturated with the smell of wet grass. Leo took off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders as the wind picked up. His gaze was calm, but there was something more than just concern in it. We were sitting at a table in a small cafe on the corner. The soft light of the lamps fell on his face, emphasizing every feature. Leo was looking at me, listening intently to my story, and his hand accidentally touched mine. It was a moment that will be remembered forever. The rain started suddenly, and we hid under one umbrella. Hugging each other tightly, we laughed as we watched the water trickle down the streets. He threw his jacket over me again, and I felt the warmth of his hand on my shoulder. The rain finally stopped, but we remained on the street for a long time, walking side by side. Our conversation turned to a deeper topic. I asked Leo about why he once left without saying goodbye. His answer was unexpected, and his tone colder than I expected. "Some things are better left in the past," he said, looking off into the distance. I felt like an invisible wall had grown between us, and that moment overshadowed the entire evening. The next morning, I couldn't get our conversation out of my head. Everything inside me screamed that I should understand him, but his words did not give me peace. I called Leo and asked to meet. He appeared at the meeting place, a small cafe near the lake. I saw the tiredness in his eyes that he tried to hide. Sitting down at the table across from me, he quietly said, "I'm sorry I was so abrupt yesterday." The conversation became calmer, and we began to reminisce about the past. Leo told me how often he thought about the day we first met. He drew everything down to the smallest detail. How I laughed, how I held a large book in my hands, how I straightened my hair in embarrassment. I listened to him as if reliving those moments. The feeling of turning back time made me smile. A few days later, he invited me to the roof of the house where we spent our first evening together many years ago. The evening was clear, and the city below shone with millions of lights. Leo spread a blanket on the floor and prepared a thermos of hot tea. We sat next to each other, wrapped in a blanket, and looked at the stars. I felt his hand lightly touch mine, and it was warmer than any words. We spent these few weeks together, but I felt that Leo still held something inside him. One evening, I couldn't help myself. "Why do you always try to hide from what you feel?" His face changed, his dark eyes quivering with the emotions he had suppressed for so long. "Because I'm afraid of losing you again," he said, and I realized how important this moment was. I held out my hand, and he didn't look away. Our palms met, and at that moment I felt the invisible wall between us crumble. His fingers were shaking slightly, but he didn't let go of my hand. We stood as if the whole world had stopped, and only our hearts were beating in unison. The next day, we went for a long walk along the promenade. The water was calm, and the fresh air filled thoughts with lightness. Suddenly, Leo stopped and looked at me as if he was about to say something important. "I never thought that I would find you again, and that it would be so difficult, but at the same time so right," he said quietly. His words seemed full of pain and hope at the same time. Later that evening, when we got back to my house, I turned on an old record. The music filled the room, and Leo unexpectedly offered to dance. We slowly circled the room, only the dim light of the table lamp illuminating our faces. I felt his breath very close and heard his heart beat to the rhythm of the music. Leo suddenly pulled away and sat on the edge of the couch, head down. "I'm not sure I deserve this chance," he said almost in a whisper. I sat down next to him, putting my arms around his shoulders. "You deserve it, and you know it," I replied, looking straight into his dark, deep eyes. We decided to go outside the city to watch the shooting star. The night was cold but clear, and we lay on a blanket covered in starlight. Leo pointed to each constellation, telling stories that I listened to with delight. Suddenly, one star fell, and I closed my eyes, making a wish. I felt his hand lightly cover mine. When the first snow fell, we went for a walk in the park. Everything around was wrapped in a white blanket, and the trees, like fairy tale giants, hid their branches under snow caps. We walked side by side, leaving footprints in the untouched snow. Leo bent down and picked up the snowball, then threw it at me a moment later, laughing like a boy. I laughed with him as I felt the cold snow catch my coat collar. After returning from the walk, we decided to warm ourselves by the fireplace. Leo started the fire, and I made marshmallow hot chocolate. We sat on the carpet, wrapped in blankets, and watched the flames dance in the fireplace. His voice was soft and warm as he told me about his childhood dreams. I listened, fascinated, holding a cup of hot chocolate in my hands. One evening, Leo found an old piano that was left at my parents' house. He ran his fingers carefully over the keys, and a soft sound filled the room. "I haven't played in a while," he said, but he tried anyway. His melody was simple, but there was something special about it, something that made the heart beat faster. I crouched next to him, listening to each note, and felt him delve into his memories. The next day, there was a heavy blizzard, and we stayed at home. I offered to cook dinner together. Leo clumsily tried to cut the vegetables, and I laughed, watching his efforts. When the whole kitchen was filled with the aroma of cooking, he suddenly stopped, came closer, and gently wiped the flour from my nose. This gesture was unexpected, but so gentle that I held my breath for a moment. Later that evening, we sat by the window, watching the blizzard that didn't let up. Leo suddenly took my hand and, looking straight into my eyes, said, "I want you to know that I will never leave you again." His words were sincere, and there was such strength in them that I understood. He is really changing. He is really trying. I felt tears fill my eyes with warmth, but this time they were from happiness. A few days later, when the blizzard subsided, we decided to take a walk in the forest. The fresh snow cover glistened under the weak winter sun. I walked ahead, leaving footprints, and Leo followed me. Suddenly, he caught up with me and gently hugged me from behind, covering my arms with his. "You have no idea how much you mean to me," he whispered. His voice was so sincere that I forgot about everything in the world for a moment. In a cozy cafe where we stopped to rest, a slight argument broke out between us. Leo tried to convince me that I should have returned to the city earlier to avoid the blizzard, but I stood my ground that the walk was worth every minute. His glare flashed but quickly faded as I smiled and said, "Well, you're right, but just this once." He just huffed and handed me a cup of hot chocolate. A week later, the weather changed. The frozen snow melted, and the evening greeted us with light rain. We walked down the street under one umbrella. Leo put his arms around my shoulders, and I listened to the drops pattering on the fabric above our heads. He suddenly stopped, took off his coat, and threw it over my shoulders, although he himself remained in a thin sweater. "I don't want you to freeze," he said quietly. One evening, I found an old photo album when I was cleaning my room. We sat down on the sofa and started looking at the pictures. On some of them, we were completely children, still carefree and happy. "You were so funny," I said, laughing, pointing to a picture of Leo in costume at the school play. He just rolled his eyes, but his smile betrayed nostalgia. Winter was coming to an end, and we decided to decorate the Christmas tree together, even though Christmas had already passed. Leo clumsily hung the garlands, and I laughed, watching him get tangled in their tangle. "I guess I better do that," I joked, but he just leaned into me whispering, "I'm here to entertain you." This moment was so simple, yet so important. One evening, I found an old player with my favorite records. We turned on the music, and a tune that was once very important to me filled the room. "This song is about you," I whispered, looking down. Leo listened attentively, and it seemed that every note touched his soul. Suddenly, he extended his hand to me. "Dance with me." And although it was unexpected, I could not refuse. One morning, I woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Entering the kitchen, she saw Leo diligently preparing breakfast. Waffles, berries, and whipped cream were all ready on the table. "This is for you," he said with a smile, and it became clear from his appearance that he was not yet completely familiar with cooking. I laughed, but still appreciated his effort. A few days later, we went to the store together to pick out a present for my friend. Leo walked between the rows, joking about every little thing he found. But then his face changed when he saw a small figurine that reminded him of his childhood. "My mom had the same one," he said quietly. I understood that it was important to him, and I postponed the search to be near him. That night, we could not sleep for a long time. Instead, they sat on the balcony, wrapped in blankets, looking at the starry sky. Leo told me about his dreams and fears, about what worries and inspires him. I listened attentively, holding his hand. I wasn't always who I wanted to be, he said, and I felt something in his voice touch me. One day, I noticed that Leo was thoughtful and silent. We were sitting in a coffee shop, and I could feel something bothering him. What happened? I asked. He thought for a moment and then quietly replied, I'm afraid that this may all be over. There was something about his words that made me put down my cup and take his hand tightly. I'm here, and that's the most important thing, I replied. The next morning, while we were walking in the park, it started to snow again. Leo suddenly tore off his glove, molded a snowball, and threw it in my side. I didn't even have time to understand what happened as he laughed and ran on. Oh, you! I exclaimed, quickly molded my snowman and ran after him. We laughed and ran and threw ourselves in the snow until we collapsed on the snow next to each other, breathless with laughter. While cleaning, Leo came across an old letter he had written years ago but never sent. He sat with it in his hands, silent, his face focused. It was a letter to my best friend? He said without looking up. I sat down next to him and touched his shoulder. What's in it? He handed me the paper, and I read the lines full of pain, hope, and apology. That evening, when the temperature dropped, we decided to light the fireplace. Leo was busy with firewood, and I tried to help, although I did not know how to do it correctly. Finally, the fire was lit, and we sat down in front of it on a soft blanket. I cupped the hot cup of tea in my hands, watching the shadows dance across his face. It reminds me of my childhood, he said quietly. One evening, we decided to watch an old black and white movie that I had wanted to show him for a long time. We snuggled up on the couch under one blanket, and I eagerly awaited his reaction. He was looking intently at the screen, and I was furtively watching his face. It's strange but beautiful in its own way, he said at the end. At dawn, we headed up the hill to see the sunrise. Leo took a thermos with hot tea, and I grabbed warm blankets. We sat side by side, looking at the light that was beginning to envelop the horizon. Do you often think about the future? I asked. He thought for a moment and then replied, I'm only thinking about what's next to me right now. One evening, while we were making dinner, I accidentally touched a glass and it shattered into small pieces. Don't worry, Leo said, immediately picking up the broom. I stood nearby and watched in silence as he carefully cleaned the glass. Then he came over, took my hands in his. Are you okay? There was so much concern in his voice that I couldn't help but smile. We sat on the floor looking at old photos. Leo was showing me pictures of his childhood, and I saw his genuine laugh for the first time. This is my first bike, he said, showing a photo of a boy with disheveled hair. We laughed and reminisced about the funny moments until we reached his teenage years. There was something about his gaze that made me catch my breath. I found out that Leo used to play the piano and talked him into playing for me. At first he hesitated, but then sat down to the instrument. His fingers touched the keys uncertainly, but gradually the melody became confident and penetrating. I stood nearby, amazed at how deeply the music reflected his inner world. When he finished, I clapped my hands and he smiled sheepishly. That night, the thunderstorm seemed especially strong to me. I woke up to the sound of thunder and saw Leo by the window. Can't sleep, he said, looking at the lightning that lit up the sky. I went to him and put my head on his shoulder. We stood in silence, listening to the sound of the rain and watching the elements, which seemed to reflect our unspoken emotions. We were walking in the evening when Leo suddenly stopped and took my hand. I have something to say, he began, looking into my eyes. His voice trembled and his eyes showed sincerity. You mean more to me than I can explain. My heart raced and I quietly replied, I feel it too. When we got home, Leo opened the closet and took out a small box. I've been holding this for you for a long time, he said, handing it to me. Inside was an elegant pendant in the shape of a star. It reminds me of how bright you are in my life, he added, smiling slightly sheepishly. I silently let him put it around my neck, feeling the warmth of his touch. We decided to walk across the frozen lake holding hands. The ice was transparent and frozen air bubbles could be seen through it. It's a little scary, isn't it? I asked, snuggling closer to him. Leo just smiled. I'm holding you. You have nothing to fear. His voice and the warmth of his hands gave me the confidence to take a few more steps forward. We sat on a park bench, wrapped in blankets, and drank hot coffee that we bought from a small kiosk nearby. Steam from the cups rose into the air, enveloping us in warmth. Why do you like winter so much? I asked. Leo thought for a moment. Maybe because she gives a sense of new beginnings. His words made me think about what I myself expect from the future. Music was playing in the background while we were cooking dinner, and suddenly, as if on impulse, Leo reached out. Shall we dance? He asked with a slight smile. I laughed. The kitchen is right here, but he didn't listen. He carefully pulled me along. We moved slowly to the beat of the melody between the pans and chairs as if time had stopped. When we got home from the walk, my hands were so frozen that I couldn't even take off my gloves. Leo saw this and immediately took my hands in his. You're not taking care of yourself at all, he said, warming my fingers with his breath. His care was so genuine that I felt my heart sink from the warmth he gave. One clear evening, we decided to stay outdoors a little longer. Leo spread out a blanket on the snowy hill, and we lay there looking at the stars. Look, there's the Big Dipper, he said, pointing up. I laughed. Do you know astronomy well? He shrugged. No, but I know enough to show you the brightest stars. This moment seemed magical, as if the entire universe had frozen with us. The morning started with Leo persuading me to go outside despite the cold. You won't regret it, he said with an enigmatic smile. We reached the park, where he began to sculpt a snowman. This is for you, he said, attaching a small red scarf around the figure's neck. The snowman turned out funny, but cute, and I couldn't stop laughing. One day, flipping through old books, I came across an envelope with Leo's name on it. What is it? I asked, handing it to him. He, visibly confused, took the envelope and remained silent for a while. This is a letter I wrote to myself years ago, he said with a smile. His words revealed a part of the past that he rarely showed. The evening was quiet until Leo messed with my pillow. What is this? A challenge? I smiled, picking her up and hitting her back. Laughter filled the room as we ran around the sofa like children. Give up? Leo shouted, trying to dodge another blow. At that moment, everything seemed simple and carefree. One morning, Leo told me that he had a dream in which we were traveling through an unknown country. It was incredible, he said, smiling. Maybe we really will someday? I asked, dreaming that one day it might become a reality. We decided to look at an old photo album. Leo took it from the top shelf, and we sat on the floor next to the couch, flipping through the pages. These are my parents, he said, pointing to a yellowed photo. His voice sounded warm, but with a hint of sadness. You were so funny as a kid, I laughed when I saw his baby photo. Don't laugh, you must have had weird hairdos too, he replied with a wry smile. Late at night, I got a text from Leo. Are you sleeping yet? I smiled, answering, Not yet. What about you? After a few seconds came the answer. I was wondering if I should say that I already missed you. My heart filled with warmth, and I automatically typed, I miss you too. Good night. New Year's Day has come, and we decided to decorate the Christmas tree. Leo picked up the toy box, and we started hanging glass balls and garlands. This is my favorite, he said, holding the tiny wooden angel. We stood looking at the finished tree, and Leo quietly added, This is probably the most relaxing Christmas I've ever had. The light in the house suddenly went out, and Leo, not confused, took out the candles. Well, a romantic candlelit dinner, he joked, placing them around the room. We sat at the table, lit by a warm shimmer, talking about anything that came to mind. Time seemed to stand still, leaving the two of us in this cozy world. Leo suggested going for a walk outside the city, and I agreed without hesitation. We took a thermos with hot tea, a blanket, and went to the lake. The wind was cool, but the fresh air refreshed the mind. Look how beautiful it is here, he said when we got ashore. We spread out a blanket and just sat there watching the sky change colors from blue to orange. The evening was quiet, and suddenly Leo turned on the music on his phone. Dance with me, he said, holding out his hand. I laughed at first, but then succumbed to this spontaneous idea. We moved slowly to the soft rhythm of the melody without even turning on the lights. Just us, the shadows, and the sound that filled the room. Leo appeared with a small box wrapped in shiny paper. This is for you, he said with an enigmatic smile. I carefully opened the package, revealing a bracelet with a small star-shaped pendant inside. He will remind you of our starry nights, said Leo. I looked at him, trying to hide my excitement, but he seemed to understand everything anyway. One day we were walking through the city, and Leo suddenly stopped at an intersection. What happened? I asked. He looked at me seriously and said, Have you ever wondered if one decision can change your life? His words made me stop and think. This moment was another reminder of how deeply we understand each other. Leo said that he had to leave on business for a few days. We were standing at the station, and the train was already ready to leave. I'll be back soon, he said, smiling, but I saw sadness in his eyes. I'll wait, I answered, trying not to show my emotions. He disappeared into the carriage, leaving me with thoughts and worries. Days passed, and Leo returned. We met in the same place where we said goodbye. I saw him from afar and ran towards him without even thinking about the people around. He opened his arms, and I finally felt that everything fell into place again. I promised I'd be back soon, he said, smiling. That evening, we went to the hill where the sky always seemed closer. Leo spread a blanket, and we sat down next to each other. He pointed to the stars. Look, that's Ursa Major, and there's Orion. I listened to him talk about the constellations, and his voice sounded so calm, as if he was trying to convey a piece of this calm to me. Did you believe in wishes made on shooting stars? I asked. Yes, and one day I made a wish for you to appear in my life, he answered, looking at me with that warm smile that always melted away all doubts. We were walking in the park when suddenly it started to rain. There was neither an umbrella nor even a hooded jacket. Leo laughed. Well, looks like we have an unplanned test. I looked at him confused, but he, without waiting for an answer, took my hand and began to circle in the rain. We laughed like children, completely forgetting about wet clothes. The water ran down in strands from my hair, and I suddenly realized how happy I was here and now. Leo finds an old letter he wrote to himself as a teenager. He decided to read it to me. His voice was filled with a hint of irony. I hope you've already found your dream and aren't afraid to take risks. And maybe you've already met someone you want to spend your life with. He stopped and looked at me. I think the teenager in that letter might be pleased, he added quietly, smiling. Today we cooked together, Leo announced, and I couldn't pass up the idea, even knowing that with my cooking skills, it could end in disaster. The kitchen was chaos. There was flour everywhere except the dough, and I almost burned the pan. But laughter and carelessness created a real holiday. In the end, we did make something edible, and Leo solemnly served it on the table as if it were a masterpiece. At sunset, we went to the bridge. The air was cool, but I hardly noticed it standing next to Leo. He leaned on the railing and looked into the distance. Sometimes it seems that the river just flows and takes all thoughts with it, he said. And I realized how much his words reflected my own mood. We stood there in silence, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon, and the silence was most eloquent. The light suddenly went out, leaving us in complete darkness. Electricity? I asked. Leo just shrugged and took out the candles. This is even better, he said, lighting them. Candlelight gave the room a soft, warm glow. We sat at the table talking about childhood, dreams, and what we wanted to be. His stories made me laugh and sometimes think about how far we all come from our first ideas about life. The snow began to fall in large, fluffy flakes as we entered the woods. The trees stood dressed in white, and every step left a mark on the loose snow. It's like a fairy tale, I said, breathing in the cold, fresh air. Leo plucked a small twig from the Christmas tree and decorated my hat with it. Now you are the main character of this fairy tale, he joked. We laughed and kept walking, enjoying the peace that surrounded us on all sides. We found an old photo album, and Leo started flipping through its pages. This is my first Christmas, he said, pointing to a picture of a little boy standing by a tree with a huge package in his hands. His laughter echoed as he told funny stories from his childhood. Then we got the pictures taken recently, and I saw how many moments we had already experienced together. We have something to remember, he said quietly, and I understood that this was only the beginning. We decided not just to go for a walk, but to add some children's entertainment. Leo started by throwing the first snowball that hit me right in the shoulder. This is war, I laughed, quickly molding the snow into a ball. We ran between the trees, hiding and attacking each other. Finally, I grabbed the snow and threw it right on his head. "I surrender," he exclaimed, throwing up his hands, but his laughter showed that he was not at all opposed to the game. We stopped by a lake that was completely frozen. Leo suddenly took my hand and silently looked into my eyes. "There is something I have to tell you," he began. His voice was shaky, but there was confidence in it. "You are more to me than just a friend or a part of my life. You are what makes me want to be better." I felt my breath catch and could only answer, "And you for me too." We found a place near the forest where we could light a small fire. Leo prepared everything necessary, and soon I could feel the heat from the flame that illuminated his face. "Do you remember how when we were children we dreamed of lighting a fire and telling stories?" he asked, adding a branch to the fire. "Now, this isn't just a dream," I replied, watching the sparks shoot up into the sky. We sat side by side, wrapped in blankets, and listened in silence to the creaking of the wood while the stars shone brighter than usual. Leo decided to decorate his house for Christmas, and of course, I had to help. We hung garlands, and I laughed when he painstakingly arranged the candles on the windowsill. "You're taking this very seriously," I joked. "There are no small things in the holiday," he replied with a wink. I decorated the tree while he untangled the garland that was tangled in the box. Our house lit up with warmth and comfort, and I felt that this Christmas would be unforgettable. We went to the ice rink, and it was the first time for me. Leo held my hand, but I still slid precariously, laughing every time I almost fell. "Don't worry, I won't let you fall," he assured, but he barely kept his balance and we both fell into the snow. The laughter was so loud that the people around began to smile too. I looked at him lying in the snow and thought how wonderful it was to feel like a child next to him. That evening, we decided to spend time with books. Leo was lying on the sofa, engrossed in another novel, and I was sitting next to him with a blanket and a cup of cocoa, reading something lighter. "You know how hard it is not to interfere when you're laughing at a book?" he said, looking up from his reading. I just smiled and gave him my book. "Try it yourself," I replied, and we both started reading funny passages to each other. Fireworks were already going off outside as we raised our glasses to the passing year. "What do you want to wish for next?" I asked, looking at Leo. He thought for a moment and then answered, "May the next year be like this evening, filled with warmth, laughter, and you." His words penetrated deep into my heart. I made a wish and quietly whispered, "Let it come true." After midnight, we went outside. The air was cold but clear, and the stars in the sky shone brighter than usual. Leo stopped in the middle of the road, looked up, and said, "Look at how many stars there are. They seem like you can touch them." I quietly came closer, feeling his presence, and also looked at the sky. "Here in this light, I feel that anything is possible," I whispered. We stood side by side, watching infinity. We waited for dawn, standing by a small hill. The horizon began to light up in shades of soft pink and gold, and the snow beneath our feet shimmered in the morning light. Leo held my hand, silently watching the world wake up. "That's great," I said, holding my breath. "Yes, but not as much as you," he replied quietly, his words staying with me even after the sun had fully risen. The lake was completely frozen, and we decided to walk on its surface. Leo wasn't sure if the ice would hold at first, but after a few cautious steps, we boldly continued on. I tried to slide on the ice, although it was more like a chaotic run. "Look as you should," Leo said, and tried to lead by example, but quickly lost his balance. We both fell down laughing until we cried. This moment was so simple, and yet so perfect. We went to a small cafe to warm up. It was cozy inside, smelling of coffee and fresh baked goods. Leo ordered hot chocolate for us, and we sat down at a table by the window. He looked at me in a peculiar way, as if he wanted to say something but remained silent. "What?" I asked, looking into his eyes. "I'm just thinking how lucky I am to be here with you," he replied, and I felt my heart beat faster. He found an old letter written in his youth. We sat on the couch and Leo read it out loud. These were simple, sincere words about the dreams he had in those years. "I didn't even know then that you would be there in the most important moments," he said, finishing the reading. His voice was warm and his eyes were penetrating. "I didn't know that either, but I'm glad it happened," I replied, and we exchanged smiles that said more than any words could. We happened to come across an old photo album when we were sorting things out in his apartment. Leo opened it and we started going through the pictures. There were pictures of his childhood, school years, first trips. He would point to each photo as he told stories and laugh when he got to the funny parts. It was me at the costume party. Don't ask me why I dressed as a pirate, he said, and we both laughed. Looking through the album, I felt how we are becoming even closer. We went downtown for a walk and unexpectedly ran into his old friend. Leo smiled and hugged him, then introduced me. She's an old friend of mine, he said with a faint hint of meaning. His friend looked at us and smiled. Something tells me this is more than just friendship. Leo just laughed, and I felt my face flush with blush. This meeting left a warm mark in my heart. In a small souvenir shop, I saw a postcard with a picturesque landscape that reminded me of the place where we spent time a few years ago. Look how it looks like that lake, I said, showing it to Leo. He looked at the card and nodded. Let's take it. It will be like a symbol. I raised my eyebrows in surprise. A symbol of what? Leo smiled. A sign that good times can be repeated. His words made me smile. Leo approached me with a thoughtful look. And if we go out of town for a few days? He asked. I immediately agreed, and we started making a list of things for the trip. He painstakingly wrote down every little thing, and I joked, maybe you only forgot the parachute. Leo laughed. Maybe you're right. Let's add him to the list. This moment of preparation was so warm and simple that I didn't even want it to end. We arrived at a small mountain town. The streets were covered with snow, and the houses with wooden roofs looked like something from a postcard. Leo held my hand as he led me along the narrow paths that led to the mountain slopes. Time seems to have stopped here, I said, looking at the surrounding beauty. He smiled. And let it stop. I like this moment. We breathed in the cold, clean air, feeling that this day will remain in our memory forever. In the evening, we decided to stop at the foot of the mountain. Leo quickly lit the fire, and I brought some branches to support the flames. We sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the sound of the crackling wood. I don't remember the last time I just sat like that and did nothing, Leo said, looking at me. Sometimes that's the best thing to do, I replied, clutching a cup of hot tea. The fire illuminated his face, and this peaceful moment seemed priceless. The next morning, we noticed a small frozen lake not far from our route. Leo offered to try to cross it, but the ice crunched treacherously underfoot. It's dangerous, I warned, but he only smiled and took a few steps cautiously. The ice held, and Leo began to call me after him. I'm not sure about that, I said, standing on the bank. You trust me, don't you? He asked, holding out his hand. And despite the fear, I took the first step. We decided to take a walk in the snowy forest after dinner. The moon illuminated our path, and the snow crunched under our feet with each step. Looks like the shadows come alive here, Leo joked as he stopped by a large tree. I laughed. Maybe it's just your imagination. Suddenly, he took my hand and said, Look, there is a shooting star in the sky. We both stopped, looking up at the night sky, and in that moment, everything around us seemed magical. Returning to the house in the mountains, we lit the fireplace. The air smelled of firewood and aromatic tea. Leo sat on the rug by the fire, studying a map of the neighborhood, while I set the table for a light supper. What are you looking for? I asked, watching him jot something down on a piece of paper. The route for tomorrow, he replied with a smile. I sat next to him, and together we began to plan our further adventures. Our time in the mountains was coming to an end. We stood on the threshold of the house, looking at the snow-capped peaks in the distance. I wish it would last longer, I said, feeling sadness envelop my heart. Leo hugged me, holding me tightly. This isn't the end. We can always come back here, he whispered. This moment seemed like an eternity, which we wanted to keep in our memory forever. The way back was quiet, each of us immersed in our thoughts. The snow, which seemed like a fairy tale just a few days ago, is now gradually disappearing, changing to wet asphalt. Leo was driving, his eyes focused on the road. I looked out the window, watching the scenery change. I'll miss that place, I said, breaking the silence. He smiled, not taking his eyes off the road. Don't be sad. We'll get back there. When we returned, we decided to visit the coffee shop that we always loved. It was crowded inside, but cozy. Leo chose a table by the window and we sat down, looking at the lights outside. Looks like nothing's changing here, he said, stirring his coffee drink. And that's good, I replied. The warm atmosphere of the cafe was just what we were missing after the road. The next day, Leo invited me for a walk to a nearby lake. The water was calm, and the trees that lined the shore were reflected in its surface. We sat on a bench, silently watching the sunset. I always thought you brought peace to my life, he said suddenly. I looked at him, feeling the words touch my heart. And I thought that it was you who always put it in order, I answered. I couldn't sleep that night. Thoughts about our time in the mountains and the future swirled in my head. Suddenly the phone rang. It was Leo. Can't you sleep too? He asked, barely hiding the smile in his voice. How did you guess? I answered, laughing. We talked about everything and nothing until dawn outside the window. This call was unexpected, but I felt that we became even closer. Leo showed me a place that meant a lot to him, an old library where he liked to spend time. It's always quiet here and I can think, he said, running his hand across the wooden table. We sat together looking through old books. Each of them was like a portal to another world, and I understood why he loved this place. After a day full of activities, Leo suggested an evening walk around the city. The streets glowed with the warm yellow light of lanterns, and the snowflakes that slowly fell from the sky added a special comfort to this moment. Do you notice how the snow changes the city? He asked, walking beside him. I smiled. It seems as if it erases everything superfluous, leaving only beauty. We were treading carefully on the sidewalks on which a light layer of snow had already gathered, and suddenly Leo held out his hand to me. Let me help, he said, and I took his hand without thinking. It was a simple gesture, but I could feel the warmth of his touch dispelling the cold. We stopped at a bridge overlooking the river, which mirrored the lights of the city. I love this place, he said quietly. Time seems to stand still here. One day Leo suggested visiting a museum. I know this may sound boring, but I want to show you something, he said as we entered the ancient building. It was quiet inside, only our steps disturbed the peace of the spacious halls. He led me to a small hall where objects from ancient times were stored. This sword was found not far from where I grew up, he explained, pausing next to an ancient exhibit. His voice sounded like it was part of his story. We looked at each detail for a long time, exchanging ideas about what secrets these things could hide. At some point, I noticed how Leo was looking at me and realized that it was important for him to share this with me. An unexpected rain caught us in the middle of the walk. At first, we tried to find shelter, but realized that we were hopelessly soaked. Looks like fate decided to throw in a little adventure, Leo said, laughing as water ran down his hair. At least you're not afraid to mess up your hair, I jokingly replied. We walked in the rain, feeling the water seeping through our clothes and the cold against our skin, but with it came a strange sense of freedom. At one point, Leo stopped, looked at me and said, You look happy even now. I just nodded. It's because I'm next to you. In the evening, we returned home, heated tea, and sat by the window. The street was flooded with the light of lanterns, and the snow began to fall again. Leo, have you ever thought about what comes next? I asked, looking at him. He thought for a while and then replied, I often think, but the future doesn't matter to me if you're not in it. His words were simple, but they touched my soul. The next morning, I got a text from Leo. Ready for adventure? While I was trying to understand what he was up to, he was already standing at my doorstep with tickets in hand. We're going to one place I've been wanting to show you for a long time, he said, smiling enigmatically. A few hours later, we found ourselves at a small railway station surrounded by snow-covered trees. This place has always helped me gather my thoughts, he explained. We sat down on a bench waiting for the train, and I felt excitement and curiosity intertwine inside me. In the train, we sat next to each other by the window. The scenery changed so quickly that it seemed as if time sped up. Leo, you never said where we're going, I asked, looking at his puzzled expression. It's a surprise, but you'll definitely like it, he replied, not taking his eyes off the window. I felt his hand touch mine, and this simple gesture filled me with peace. We talked about childhood, dreams, and plans until the train stopped at a small station surrounded by a dense forest. The place where we arrived resembled a fairy tale. Tall trees were covered with snow, their branches glittered in the sun as if they were covered with diamonds. This place is part of my childhood, Leo said, stopping by one of the trees and running his hand along its rough bark. I love to dream here, and this place always inspired me. We walked along the narrow path, talking about everything in the world. Suddenly, Leo stopped, plucked a small twig from the Christmas tree, and handed it to me. As a memory, we spent the evening in a small house where the owners lit the fireplace. The fire danced in the fireplace, casting warm reflections on the walls. We sat next to each other, wrapped in soft blankets with cups of hot tea in our hands. You know, it's the perfect way to end the day, Leo said, leaning slightly towards me. You're right, I replied, watching his face light up in flames. We spoke in whispers as if we were afraid to destroy the magic of the moment. The next morning, we went to a small frozen lake that was not far from the lodge. Leo suggested a walk on the ice. I hesitated at first, but his confidence convinced me. Don't be afraid, I'm holding you, he said, squeezing my hand tightly. The ice was transparent and small bubbles of air could be seen under it, as if frozen in time. We reached the middle of the lake where we stopped, staring at the horizon. It's amazing how such simple things can bring happiness, he said, and I felt that moment would stay with me forever. Leo took a pair of skates out of his backpack. I'm not sure that's a good idea, I said, looking at him in disbelief. He just smiled. Trust me, it will be fun. After a few minutes of uncertain attempts, I was already sliding next to him, even though I was holding on to his hand. Leo moved forward with ease, occasionally turning back to cheer me on. At one point, I let go of his hand, trying to keep my balance on my own, but fell to the ice laughing. He ran over to me and held out his hand to help me up. So, will you trust me again? After an active day, we returned to the house where the host prepared a warm dinner. It smelled of fresh bread and hot soup. We sat down at the table, and the fire in the fireplace added coziness again. I can't believe it's such a wonderful day, I said, looking at Leo. He answered quietly, That's because you were around. We spoke at length, discussing not only today, but how much had changed in the past months. His voice was calm and warm, and I couldn't take my eyes off his eyes. At night, Leo suggested going outside to see the stars. The sky was clear, and for the first time, I noticed how many of them were visible here. We climbed a small hill, from where there was a wonderful view of the night sky. He spread a warm blanket on the snow, and we sat down next to each other. Did you ever think that the stars are so close? He asked, pointing to the constellations. I nodded, feeling this moment fill everything inside with warmth. We were silent for a long time, just looking up, and that silence spoke louder than any words. The next morning, we packed up to go home. I felt how difficult it was to leave this place. Leo, as if reading my mind, said, This is just one of our adventures. There are many more days like this ahead of us. We went to the station, where the train was already waiting for us. While we were standing on the platform, I felt him squeeze my hand lightly. I want you to know that this place is even more special because you were here with me, he said quietly. The train moved forward, leaving behind a snowy landscape. We sat in silence, looking out the window. Everything that happened these days seemed like a fairy tale that would soon dissolve into reality. How do you feel now? Leo asked, leaning slightly towards me. It feels like I'm leaving a part of myself in that forest, I replied. He smiled. This place will always stay with you, as will the memories of it. I felt his hand touch mine, and this simple gesture calmed my raging thoughts. When we got back to the city, everything looked normal, but I felt that something had changed. Leo was walking me home, and when we were standing at the door, he stopped. I know we're back to normal, but I don't want this bond between us to disappear, he said, looking straight into my eyes. This bond has already become a part of me, I replied. His smile was as warm as the days we spent together. A few days later, Leo invited me for a walk around the city. The snow still lay on the streets, but it was warm, and the first breath of spring could already be felt in the air. We walked through narrow streets, laughed, and discussed plans for the near future. Did you ever think that our lives would change like this? He asked. I stopped and looked at him. I didn't even know that meeting you would become something so important. His look was as if he wanted to say more, but stopped, just smiling. We found a small cafe with panoramic windows, stopped there for a cup of coffee. It was warm inside, and I felt the cold behind the glass. Leo spoke about his dreams. I always wanted to find something more than just an ordinary life. And now I know that it is not a place, but the people who are nearby. His words made me think. And I've always thought that happiness is the little things that make up a big puzzle, I replied, noticing how he nods thoughtfully. Before saying goodbye, Leo suddenly said, I want our next adventure to be even more special. Promise you won't give up. His voice was serious, but there was a light of anticipation in his eyes. How can I refuse? I answered, not holding back a smile. He leaned closer and quietly added, Then hold on, because something incredible is about to happen. I felt how this moment became another small memory that will warm me for a long time. The next few days passed in a pleasant foreboding. Leo did not reveal the details, but his mysteriousness only added to the intrigue. He wrote a short message. Be ready for tomorrow. It will be something unforgettable. I spent the evening getting ready, choosing clothes and imagining what he was up to. Thoughts were confused, but at the same time, I felt warmth and joy. The evening came, and Leo invited me to meet him near the old tower, which was illuminated by lanterns. When I approached, he was already waiting, his face illuminated by a weak yellow light. How beautiful, I said, looking at the glow around. This is just the beginning, Leo replied. He gave me his hand, and together we climbed the steps of the tower to see the whole city from above. This place reminds me of old dreams, he whispered as we reached the top. It was cold at the top of the tower, but neither of us noticed. The city spread out in front of us like a living painting, with thousands of lights and snowy roofs of houses. I've always wanted to share this place with someone special, Leo said, looking down. I was silent because I felt that this moment was becoming unforgettable. His hand touched mine, and I realized that right now I didn't want to be anywhere else but next to him. As we descended, Leo suddenly suggested, I know you have a lot of plans, but is there room in them for one more big adventure? His words seemed like a challenge to me, and I smiled. I'm always ready for something new when I'm around you, I answered. He laughed. That's great. Then let's start something big. We walked the streets of the city, discussing new ideas, and it was one of those conversations that remain in the memory forever. We found ourselves at an intersection where the lights were so bright that it seemed like a scene from a movie. Leo suddenly stopped and looked at me. Sometimes I feel like our lives are a series of crossroads where every decision can change everything, he said, his voice low but confident. I smiled. But we are not alone at these crossroads. That is the main thing. He nodded, and we continued walking in silence, enjoying the moment. We went to a small cafe to warm up. Silence reigned inside, and only light music added coziness. Leo ordered tea, and we sat at a corner table where the light barely touched our faces. This place reminds me of my childhood, he admitted. I asked why. He talked about quiet winter evenings when he and his family would gather together for a cup of tea. His memories were so warm that I felt like a part of this story. When we left the cafe, the snow began to fall in large flakes, and everything around became like a fairy tale. I put my hands under the snow and laughed. Leo stopped next to me and looked at me. You look like it's the best time of your life, he said, smiling. Isn't that right? I answered. And we stood in this magical snowfall, forgetting about time. Returning home, we talked about everything in the world. Leo told stories that made me laugh and sometimes make me think. I've always believed that the most valuable thing is the moments you spend with someone who understands you, he said, and his words struck a deep chord in my heart. I was silent, only slightly squeezing his hand, and at that moment I felt that words were unnecessary. The sky was clear and starry that night. Leo suggested stopping on a hill where every star could be seen. We sat down on a wooden bench that creaked under the weight of the snow. He showed me the constellations, and I tried to remember their names. There's the Big Dipper, and next to it is the Little Dipper, said Leo, pointing to the sky. I felt like a child, fascinated by this endless space. Have you noticed that the stars shine brightest when you're with someone special? I said quietly. As we were walking back, Leo suddenly stopped and pulled something out of his pocket. It was a small but elegant bracelet with a star pendant. I wanted you to always have a piece of this evening, he said, and carefully placed the bracelet on my wrist. His warmth was transferred through the touch, and I felt my heart clench with excitement. This is the best present I've ever received, I replied, looking at him gratefully. We walked in silence. There was silence in the air, which was broken only by the light crunching of snow underfoot. I looked at the bracelet shimmering in the lantern light and thought about how this meeting had changed everything. Leo was also silent, but his presence was felt. I looked back at him and he smiled as if he knew all my thoughts. Before we left, Leo suggested we stop by the fountain, which was frozen but looked fabulous. We stood side by side, admiring the patterns of the ice. These moments seem so short, but they last forever, he said, touching the frozen edge of the fountain. I nodded, feeling his words resonate in my heart. The park was illuminated with small garlands hung between the trees. Leo suggested a little longer walk, and I couldn't refuse. We walked among these lights as if we were in a fairy tale. Sometimes you wish time would stop, he said, looking up at the twinkling lights. I laughed. I guess this place is such a stop. His eyes were full of tenderness, and I understood that this walk would be remembered forever. I felt his hand touch mine, and this gesture was so natural that I wasn't even surprised. His fingers were warm despite the cold night. It always seems like moments like this only happen in the movies, he said, gently squeezing my palm. I looked at him and smiled. Why don't we make our own movie? We walked, hand in hand, forgetting about the cold and time. We stopped near my house. Thank you for this evening, I said, not wanting to let him go. Leo just nodded, but his eyes spoke louder than words. Take care, he added, and before I could say anything, he lightly touched my shoulder and turned around. I watched his figure dissolve into the winter night for a long time, and I felt that this farewell was both the end and the beginning. I sat by the window and watched the snow cover the streets, which now seemed completely empty. The bracelet on the wrist glittered in the candlelight, and I could not take my eyes off it. He was a symbol of this evening, these moments that have now become a part of me. Thoughts about Leo filled me with warmth, although my heart sank a little with sadness.